Marcus is 34 years old and he is doing the math for the first time. Not the rough math, not the I should probably save more math he does in his head while paying for groceries. The real math, spreadsheet open, numbers typed in, compound interest calculator loaded on a second tab. He punches in $800 a month, 7% real return, 31 years until he turns 65. The number that comes back is $1,022,000. He stares at it for a moment. It looks clean, it looks achievable, it looks like a plan. The problem is Marcus has seen this number before. He ran the same calculation when he was 27. He told himself he would start then. Something came up. He ran it again at 30. Same result, roughly, same intention. And each time there was a decision, not a catastrophe, not a job loss, not a medical emergency, just a decision that looked completely reasonable at the time that quietly moved to the finish line further away. This video is about that decision, except it is not one decision, it is three. And most Canadians never see any of them clearly until it is too late to change the math. Marcus's father bought a house in Mississauga in 1987. The price was $148,000. His salary that year was $42,000. If you divide the house price by the income, you get a ratio of roughly 3.5. 3.5 years of gross salary to buy a home in one of Canada's fastest growing suburbs. In 2025, that same house, same street, same square footage, sold for $1.1 million. The median full-time wage in Canada, according to Statistics Canada's 2025 data, sits at roughly $75,000 a year before tax. Divide 1.1 million by 75,000. You get 14.5 years of gross salary to buy the house his father bought with 3.5. That ratio did not move slowly, it did not drift, it compressed an entire generation's financial flexibility in the span of about 20 years. And it did so while every financial advice column in the country was still telling people to cut out the lattes. But here is what almost no one talks about. The house was not the only thing that compounded against Marcus's generation. It was the whole starting line. Marcus's father did not need to be a sophisticated investor. He did not need to understand index funds or TFSA contribution room or the difference between an ETF and a mutual fund. He bought a house, the house went up, equity built almost automatically. His mortgage payment in year 15 was less painful than year 1 because wages had risen and the payment had not. He retired with the house paid off, a defined benefit pension from 30 years at the same employer, and OAS on top of that. Marcus has none of those mechanisms, no defined benefit pension. A mortgage that, if he ever manages to buy, will consume a far larger percentage of his take-home pay than his father's ever did. No automatic wealth building built into the structure of simply showing up to work for 3 decades. Marcus has to build wealth intentionally, deliberately, and consistently across 30 years, using tools his father never needed to touch, in a cost environment his father never had to survive. And he was never told that, not explicitly. He was handed the same general advice: work hard, save, invest for the long term. As if the ground rules had not fundamentally shifted between 1987 and today, that is not a motivational problem, that is a structural one. And it matters because it explains why Marcus did not start at 22. He did not start at 22 because he was paying off student debt. He did not start at 25 because rent in Toronto consumed 40% of his take-home pay, after a renovation pushed his building's prices up. He did not start at 28 because he got married and there were costs attached to that. He did not start at 31 because his car died and the replacement was not in the plan. None of these are excuses. Every single one of them is a real expense that a real person in a real Canadian city in the 2010s was facing. And every single year of delay had a cost that no one calculated for him at the time. Here is the calculation he was never shown. Person A starts investing $500 a month at age 25. 7% real return. At 65, they have approximately $1.37 million. Person B waits until 35 and invests $1,000 a month, double the monthly contribution, same return, same end date, same end. At 65, they have approximately $1.22 million. Person A put in $240,000 total over 40 years. Person B put in $360,000 over 30 years. Person B contributed $120,000 more and still lost. Not because they made a bad investment, because they started 10 years later. The cost of those 10 years is not the money Marcus did not put in between 22 and 32. That number is recoverable. The cost is the compounding that did not happen on money that was never invested. That cost, over 30 years, is not $100,000. It is closer to $150,000 in lost growth that required zero effort, zero skill, zero stock picking. It required only time, and time was the one thing Marcus spent without knowing its price. This is the cruelest part of the math most Canadians are never shown. The sacrifice of starting early is barely visible. $500 a month at 25 feels painful. It feels like giving something up. The reward for that sacrifice does not appear for decades, but the penalty for not making it appears quietly in a spreadsheet at age 34 when a man punches in his numbers and realizes the finish line is exactly where it should be, and also exactly 1 decade further than it had to be. And the financial system around Marcus did not help him see this earlier. In fact, it was not designed to. The average management expense ratio on Canadian mutual funds, the annual fee charged on money sitting inside those funds, is still between 2.1 and 2.3%. That is not a Canadian average in a bad year. That is a persistent structural reality. Canada has among the highest mutual fund fees of any developed country in the world. 2% sounds small. Over 30 years on a $500,000 portfolio, 2% versus a low-cost index ETF at 0.2% costs you, conservatively, over $300,000. Not $300,000 in fees you write a check for. $300,000 in growth that went to a fund company instead of to you. Quietly, every year, invisibly, in a line item most investors never read. The bank that holds Marcus's checking account does not proactively explain this to him. The advisor who sells him a mutual fund inside his RRSP earns a trailer fee, a percentage of assets paid annually by the fund company to the advisor, as long as Marcus stays in that fund. The incentive structure is not pointed toward Marcus accumulating wealth as fast as possible. It is pointed toward Marcus staying invested in the products that generate the most revenue for the institution. And the education system did not fill this gap. As of 2024, personal finance education remains an optional or minimally covered component in the majority of Canadian provincial curriculums. Ontario added a standalone financial literacy course requirement only in recent years. Most people in Marcus's generation graduated without ever being taught how compound interest worked against them in debt, or for them in investments. Without ever being shown what a management expense ratio was, without ever running the math on starting at 25 versus 35. The information exists, it is public, but the system was not designed to surface it early, clearly, and urgently. And so most Canadians arrive at the compound interest conversation in their 30s already carrying the cost of the years they did not know to count. Marcus figures it out at 34. He opens a self-directed TFSA at a discount brokerage. He sets up an automatic purchase of VEQT, a one-ticket diversified global index ETF, every 2 weeks. He reads enough to understand the basic logic: buy the market, hold through cycles, let compounding do the work. This is correct. This is exactly what the evidence says to do. Then March 2020 arrives. In 23 trading days, the S&P 500 falls 34%. Canadian markets follow. Marcus opens his account and the balance is down roughly 30% from where he started. He does not panic. He wants to be clear about that later. He does not panic. He reasons. He tells himself the situation is genuinely unprecedented. A global pandemic, supply chains halted, unemployment spiking. He tells himself this is different from a normal correction. He tells himself he will get out now, hold cash, and buy back in when there is more clarity. He sells. The market bottoms on March 23, 2020. By August, it has fully recovered. By the end of 2020, the S&P 500 is up 16% for the year, one of the strongest calendar year returns in the past 2 decades. Marcus buys back in near the top of that recovery, having locked in his losses and missed almost all of the rebound. He did not make an emotional decision, he made a reasoned one. That is the part that almost no one talks about. Every major sell-off in market history has come with a genuinely compelling narrative for why this time is different. The dot-com crash had a real story. Overvalued companies with no earnings. The 2008 financial crisis had a real story. systemic fraud inside the global banking system. COVID had a real story, an economy physically shut down by government order. The reasons were real, the fear was rational. And in every single case, the market recovered faster than the reasonable person expected. The research organization Delbar has tracked the actual returns of individual investors against index returns for decades. Their findings are consistent. The average equity fund investor underperforms the index by 3 to 4% annually. Not because they pick bad stocks, because they move in and out of the market at emotionally driven moments, buying after runs up, selling after drops down, and the gap between what the market delivers and what the investor captures is the cost of being human in a volatile system. 3 to 4% per year, run that gap over 30 years on a portfolio building toward $1 million. At 7% real return, a consistent investor reaches $1 million. At 4%, the return left after the behavioral gap, that same investor with the same contributions reaches somewhere around $550,000. The difference between $1 million and $550,000 is not investment skill. It is not stock selection. It is not even luck. It is whether you sold in March 2020, so who actually reaches $1 million by 65? According to Statistics Canada data on household wealth distribution, fewer than 15% of Canadian households hold investment assets, not including primary residence, above $500,000 at retirement age. The people who do reach the number are not uniformly high earners. They are not all in finance or tech. They are not all people who had a head start. What they share when you look at the data is a combination of three things. They started early, or at least earlier than their peers, not necessarily at 22, but they did not wait until 35. They did not sell during downturns, not because they had nerves of steel, but because they had either automated their investing to the point where selling required active effort, or because they had internalized the historical pattern deeply enough to sit on their hands when every instinct said, move. And they kept fees low, TFSA, RRSP, Index ETFs, discount brokerage. They did not pay 2% to have someone underperform the market on their behalf. Three variables, none of them require genius, none of them require a high income, though higher income makes all three easier. And every single one of them is harder than it looks from the outside, because the system pushes against all three in different ways at different moments. The cost of living in Canadian cities makes starting early hard. Financial advertising is specifically designed to exploit fear during downturns. Every correction generates a wave of content about why now is different, why you should reposition, why a managed solution might be safer. And the fee structure of the default financial products most Canadians are sold ensures that even people who do everything else right are quietly giving away a significant portion of their compounding to an institution that did not share the risk. The title of this video promised one decision. The truth is, it was never one. It was three, layered on top of each other, each one invisible until the cost had already accumulated. When to start, whether to hold when it gets hard, and who you are paying to do what you could do yourself for almost nothing. Marcus is 34. He still has 31 years. The math still works. It is not as clean as it would have been at 24, but it works. The window is not closed. But the window is also not infinite. And for every year that passes without those three decisions made and held, the math shifts. Not dramatically, quietly. The same way the gap between person A and person B in that contribution comparison shifted, 1 month at a time, invisible until you run the numbers and see what the accumulated years actually cost. The system will not change to make this easier. The cost of living in Canadian cities is not moving in a direction that helps young people start earlier. The financial industry is not redesigning its fee structures out of goodwill. The market will crash again, not if, when, and the narrative around that crash will be as convincing as every previous one. What sits inside Marcus's control is exactly what always sat inside his control. Three decisions, the order in which he prioritizes them. And whether the next time the account balance drops 30% in a month, he remembers that every person who held through every previous version of that moment came out the other side with more than they started. That is not a guarantee. Nothing in this is a guarantee. But it is the closest thing to a reliable pattern that 30 years of market data, behavioral finance research, and Canadian tax policy have produced. $1 million by 65 is not a fantasy. It is an outcome with a known set of inputs. The question is not whether the math works. It does. The question is whether you will let it.
If this story changed the way you see money, subscribe for more deep story about finance, power, and the system behind it.